So we talked a little bit about how the Constitution was made and the founding principles in it. We're going to talk today more about how it was ratified and what the different people argued about in the ratification process. So this is called Anti-Federalists and Federalists, and our question is, was the Constitution supported by all of the people in the states? Okay. So first of all, when they were making the Constitution, the 55 men had to make a lot of compromises because, again, getting 55 people to agree to something is very difficult. So you're responsible for knowing some of those main compromises. Most of these you learned about last year in U.S. history, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but you need to know them. So we have the Great Compromise, or also known as the Connecticut Compromise. It gave us the bicameral legislature with representation based on population in the House and 2 representatives per state in the Senate. So it was a compromise between the big states and the small states about how they were going to be represented in government. And then we have the 3/5 compromise between the northern and southern states. Southern states wanted to count their slaves. The northern states said, those people aren't really citizens, let's not count them. So the compromise was 3/5 of every slave would count in the representation. And then eventually, after all of the fighting about ratification, there was a Bill of Rights set in as a compromise as well, which we'll talk about. There were plenty of other things that they compromised on. For example, they argued about who should be allowed to vote. Some men wanted just white landowning males to be able to vote, and some other men said no, everybody, even people that don't own property, should be allowed to vote. So they kind of argued about that, and they eventually just compromised and said, you know what, let the states decide. And most states decided that only landowning males would be able to vote. There were a few states that didn't, but most of them did. So it wasn't until the 60s, or right after the 60s, that we had universal suffrage for everybody. Because, you know, the people that didn't own land, you know, eventually got the right to vote. Then African Americans sort of got the right to vote right after the Civil War. And then women got the right to vote. And then in the 60s, the right to vote was guaranteed because a lot of the southern states weren't, you know, they were doing like little things to stop the African Americans from voting. So it wasn't until then that everybody at age 18 and above could vote. All right, then we have, once the Constitution was written and it's finished and finalized, they had to get all of the states, most of the states, to approve it. And of course they wanted all of the states to approve it. And there was some debate about whether it should be ratified or not. Federalists wanted to ratify it. They agreed with the strong central government that they'd written into it, and they pushed for it to be ratified. Then you have the Anti-Federalists, who thought the Constitution made the national government too strong and were opposed to ratification because they felt it would step on people's liberties and freedoms and take them away. So if we spend some time on the Federalists, a lot of them were wealthy bankers, lawyers, a few plantation owners, merchants. A lot lived in urban areas where communication was better. So their trick or tool to get the word out there for ratification for the Constitution was to publish these Federalist papers. Hamilton actually started and then got some people to help him with it, John Jay and Madison. And a lot of the papers that people study the most are Madison's papers. And of course the other ones are good too, but Hamilton was kind of radical in his views. I mean, he really, if you look at what he actually wanted a king to begin with. So Madison seems to be more that middle ground describing things. So, but anyways, these guys wrote these papers, they published them in the newspaper. They were essays supporting ratification for the Constitution. People would read them and say, oh, that's a good idea, or that's not a good idea, and it kind of spread the word. For example, like number 10 dealt with the nature of factions, and his ideas are that we need a strong central government, yes, with the separation of powers and everything to control it, but because if we don't, we'll have these nature of small groups or factions that'll take over and you know, cause havoc and things like that. So 10 was important, 51, there's some others that were important. So the Anti-Federalist wrote back in the papers in return, and even the Federalists actually, there's rumor that they got one of the presses turned off so that they couldn't write a paper to explain. But mainly their thing was that the way the Constitution was written is that it would create an overburdening or overbearing central government, and it would be hostile to personal liberties. So they wanted in the Constitution a list of guaranteed liberties, things that the government could not do or could not take away. It's what became the Bill of Rights. And a couple of famous anti-federalists were Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and technically Thomas Jefferson. He was kind of the leader of this. He was probably a little bit more moderate than these other guys, but he really believed in states' rights and personal rights. So the Constitution was eventually ratified by all the states. Rhode Island was the last one in 1790, and the Anti-Federalists eventually agreed to ratify it with the promise of the Bill of Rights. And so the Bill of Rights was written and added in pretty much immediately after the Constitution was ratified. So we now have a Constitution that all the states agreed upon, and you just need to be responsible for the fundamental principles that are found in that Constitution. First, we have popular sovereignty, that the rule comes from the people, the authority of the government, the legitimacy of the government comes from the people. We have a republic, meaning we choose our leaders and those leaders represent us. It's not a direct democracy. We have limited government established by written laws or a constitution, meaning the government just can't do anything. It's limited to what is put in the Constitution. And then we have separation of powers and checks and balances. The power is separated into different groups, the 3 branches, and then each branch has a check on the other. And then, so that no one group can do anything by themselves and take over. And then, of course, we have federalism, this idea that there is a central government over all the different state governments. And we'll talk more about that in the future. That's it for today.